This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning the show is a cattle market update from Elliott Dennis, University of Nebraska at Lincoln livestock economist, as he chats about market volatility, market effects, and what is impacting input prices. K-State Extension agronomist Tina Sullivan and K-State water resource engineer Jonathan Aguilar add to the show discussing irrigation maintenance that would ideally happen before the season. Joe Gerken, K-State fisheries and aquatics extension specialist, ends the show as he explains riparian habitats and how they benefit Kansas streams, livestock, and wildlife. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from University of Nebraska at Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. Elliott, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Elliott, are we currently seeing a part of the cattle market that's having quite a bit of volatility?
Yeah, the feeder cattle and the fed cattle markets have seen quite a bit of volatility, but really given the elevated feeder cattle prices, those price swings or relative prices seem to be much more dramatic. And a lot of that is coming from kind of global risk and then even some ongoing pressure as we start to go into the spring for kind of drought conditions and precipitation. One of the things that we can do to kind of compare is just look at, the options market and where the options are being purchased at the price levels, and then really the relative split between what are put options being purchased versus the call options. So people are setting floors versus people are setting ceilings. And then we can look between the different months, the closer months versus more the later deferred months. And we see a lot of open interest, particularly in kind of that May time frame on feeder cattle. See it kind of clustering really kind of in the extremes of kind of 250 on the bottom side for feeder cattle. One of the things that when you look at kind of the options curves that we're seeing right now is that a lot of the risk is really front loaded, which means we have a lot more risk in the nearby contracts versus the deferred contracts. And so when we look at kind of the differences between risk, when we look at the November, December contracts, those are still pretty, trading decently, even though we're down a little bit. But where the option trade, which shows kind of the risk in the market from market participants, seems to be more stable than the nearby. So while we're having some issues in the Middle East and kind of in South America, that those tend to be our pricing kind of short run right now versus kind of long-term fundamental shifts in the market.
And what is some of that global risk, kind of as you mentioned, that's really making an impact?
The conflict in Iran and a lot of the questions that we've been getting in Nebraska right now is kind of how that's going to impact all the feeder cattle supply and fed cattle supply, and what that primarily does for the cost of gain for corn. And so obviously Iran is, in that area is a big oil producer. We need oil to produce gasoline. And so that's gasoline is then mixed with ethanol, which we use corn to make ethanol. And so it essentially raises kind of the cost of gain for fed cattle, which then can get passed down through the supply chain to feeder cattle. So that's how like an impact in Iran can transfer through energy to corn and then through fed down to feeder cattle. And that's why we kind of see a lot of that volatility kind of showing up there.
So as you're discussing this with your Nebraska livestock producers, what information are you sharing with them, or do you have any advice to give them?
We often talk about hedging or using some price risk protection on, or at least our output price for, fed or feeder cattle, but input prices are equally just can be hedged. And so things like hedging, like the corn, a lot of that happens through kind of the fed cattle crush that we can put out there. So, we are doing the risk management, but just, risk management on outputs, but also our inputs are equally important.
As we're thinking about our cattle, are we seeing a continued trend when it comes to cattle feeding and heavier weights?
Yeah, the big conversation that's been out there for the last several years is beef demand. Beef demand is a function of price and quantity, but we're just kind of really short cattle. One way to make that up as far as the total pounds is through raising cattle a little bit heavier. And we've seen that when we look at kind of where those closeouts have been, just comparing, the last months, we're up over about 7 to 10 days compared to the previous year. and even more days than when we look at our 5-year average. So we are feeding cattle longer, and of course we have higher carcass weights. The big thing that's really incentivizing that is really just kind of what we've historically had as a cheap cost of gain in that 97 to 105 range per hundredweight on fed cattle, and also just not a lot of heavy discounts from packers on heavier carcasses. So take both those two things combined, and we've had really good gains in the feed yard, at least isolated places here in Nebraska. And so I think that put that all together, heavier carcass weights, so we can at least make up some on aggregate beef production. But of course, fewer head just means fewer ribeyes, even though we have greater pounds.
And I feel like we've kind of asked this question a few times, but how heavy can we go when it comes to heavier carcasses?
Yeah, so I mean, if we're talking about kind of raising them to heavier weights to make up on total pounds, one of the ways that we can kind of look at this is how many, if we put an additional pound, how much of that actually goes to fat versus actually goes to lean muscle. And as they get heavier, they get longer, more of that is being put on the back fat and less is going to the muscle. Really, when we think about kind of taking those ratios at heavier weights, you would see carcass needs to rise, or these live cattle weights would need to rise about 137 pounds, and we'd need to put about 57 days on feed if we were to make up for that 4% decrease in total supply. Once again, this is total pounds, right? And we need to raise them longer and for, to heavier weights because of this idea of, the additional pound that we put on towards the end is less of that's going to actual muscle and more is going to kind of fat deposit, why we get really, really fat, yield grade 4s and 5s on those. So when you look at relative to where we are at this year versus past year, we're short, quite a bit of pounds. I guess the good news there is that there is room to grow as far as on the cattle side. And it's really just a question of how heavy packers are actually willing these cattle to go. And are we actually maximizing the genetic potential of these cattle that we have out there? And I think all those questions that maybe we haven't been able to ask in the past, that we're starting to get the opportunity to ask those now.
Elliott, will there ever be a time where the increased cost of inputs outweighs what they're going to get for cattle at the end of life?
Yeah, so in economics, if you were to know kind of what the growth path of was on the cattle, so you think of just like days on feed and weight gain, and you knew the additional weight that was being put on, that would be kind of the growth curve. Really, when we talk about where is the optimal, it's not where we're topping out the most weight we can ever put on cattle. It's really just this input to output ratio. So that's what really matters. But fundamental to that is we actually have to know the growth path of those cattle. And given that cattle are so heterogeneous, or they're so different even within a pen, that can be really difficult. But through genetics, so some feed yards, throughout the Midwest are starting to do that, start to build these models so that we can actually feed individual animals to their economic potential relative to thinking, oh, we're going to feed a pen of animals to their economic potential. Just like we went from treating animal health on pen level, and then we started to go to individual animal level. We can now are starting to try through genetics and a lot of other tracing, be able to optimize an individual animal's economic profitability relative to a pen's level profitability.
As we sit here today on March 13th, this Friday, about 2:30 p.m., JBS is planning to have a strike on Monday. And what does that mean?
Yeah, so it's going to affect about 3,800 employees. What I found most interesting is that 99% of all the employees agreed to strike. So this isn't a fraction of the individuals that are saying that they want to strike. This is a kind of company-wide. And really it's kind of fighting over wages, health, and retirement, which they say haven't kept pace. JBS is obviously countering, saying they have increased it. And so really what this ends up happening, if and when this strike occurs, it essentially creates a wedge between the box beef and the live cattle price. Because you've had limited cattle supply, they represent about 5 to 6% of total daily head capacity that goes off online, which is about 5,500 head a day. And so what that means is that the live cattle price will be kind of suppressed down or lower, and the box beef price is going to be kind of inch higher. So that difference is really that marketing margin, but it's a temporary wedge because the capacity could come back online the next day. And so how long that plant stays closed is going to be the large determinant on how the prices really adjust. And there's been a lot of posturing, and that's why we've seen some weakness or kind of variation in the cash market here, at least here in Nebraska.
Do we often see these taking a while to get resolved?
It depends on the immediacy of them. These can be quite long. I think the last time that we had this was down, there was some posturing that it was going to happen in Amarillo with the Tyson plant. That was ended up being resolved. Then we had some posturing down in the mid 2010s when strikes actually happened. So this can happen. Often it is around these wages, health, and retirement, but they do get resolved. But the longer that they go on, the markets start to adjust accordingly.
And Elliott, with the University of Nebraska, do you have a training program when we're thinking about meat processors?
This is something we've had now. It's in our third year. It's called the Meat Manager Trainee Program. We bring in kind of small to medium-sized meat processors that are in kind of the local communities and teach them kind of just business skills. We go over things like finances, the HR, HACCP plans, optimization within a plant, how to set and design a plant so that you can have increased throughput. And then we focus a little bit on further processing. So this week, we had processors from 8 different states that came in and were trained. This is our 4th cohort, and I think it's a really great program. It's affordable for plants to come in. They spend an entire week kind of build relationships and with people in different states and that they can rely upon. We just encourage anyone who has their local meat locker or has friends that might be interested in buying a meat locker to contact us, and we'd be happy to kind of get you on the waiting list to see and help really improve locker and improve kind of rural vitality and opportunities to bring people back to the farm and ranch.
Elliott, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was University of Nebraska at Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing preparations for irrigation season. And then to talk about them, we're joined by K-State Extension agronomist Tina Sullivan and K-State Water Resource Engineer Jonathan Aguilar. Tina, Jonathan, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Sure. Yep.
When we're thinking about getting prepared for irrigation time, what is one of the first things you recommend producers take the time to go check out in their field?
So the first thing that they should probably go out and check in the field is that if their irrigation system is ready for the season itself. So what does it mean? So trying to check if their nozzles are really there. It might be hanging on some other drops itself, or they might have lost a nozzle along the way during the winter time, or it could be also clogged by some kind of either animal materials or plant materials itself. So just make sure that they are probably ready for the season itself, and then just to make sure that all of the systems are running as it should be.
And when we kind of think about irrigation season, this kind of warmer than usual spring has actually kicked off some irrigation systems pretty early this year. Kind of already hearing that in Southwest, they're irrigating wheat because that profile is pretty dry. When we think about your irrigation systems, applying the water to the best of the system's ability, and that's why we talk about looking back at the pivot charts. It is the engineering document of how the machine was designed. And if we've lost a part on the machine, say something fell off, something broke, we do want to refer back to what the booklet of papers does say, because the machine was designed in a specific way. If we change a sprinkler body or a nozzle size, we're going to affect everything down the line when it comes to pressure and water output. So it is important in double checking even those nozzles. They may look like the same color, but there's a number on them, and we have to make sure we're lining up the right numbers too.
It is really very important for those nozzles to be on the correct side. And I've walked a system wherein it was just renozzled just recently and was just checking about how they renozzled it. And I found several issues on one of those systems. For example, the numbers were side by side, but they similar colors, but they are really should not be on that same location that's in itself. The other one is that I've seen some partially opened valves on those drops. For some reason, maybe before the winter time, they were trying to reduce the water on that particular drop or section, but they were still half open when I walk it through, and so that could also affect the uniformity of the system.
And what about when it comes to checking maybe travel speed?
Yes, that is correct. So in most cases, when we see a pivot chart, it also puts there how much water is being applied on the field. That is actually related to the speed of the system itself. And so if we have changed the wheels or if there was some changes in the gears at one point, we would like to make sure that it is still applying the same amount of water on the field. A quick way of looking at of checking that is by having a catch can on the field and just see if what is indicated in the pivot chart is really what is being applied in the field. We've seen that in our new linear wherein the chart was saying that it is going to apply an inch, but when we check it with our catch cans, it was actually putting close to about a quarter more an inch on that system. And so we try to dig in and look at some of the other issues that may be related to it. And one of those that we check is actually the speed of the system itself.
When we think about the speed of the machine, like our system may have a 100% speed, so the fastest it can go. And if we haven't calibrated it recently because of other changes on the system, soil condition changes, if it has actually changed, we might not be accurately timing the machine correctly either.
So while we're thinking about that irrigation system moving around the field, do we also need to take into consideration the wheel tracks to hopefully give the irrigation its best option for movement?
Yeah, when we think about wheel tracks, it may just become it's a bump in the field that we may have to travel over. Sometimes it's just a hindrance from that perspective. But the reality is they do cause some additional wear and tear on that machine over time because we have to think about big tires carrying a very heavy machine. That's not just steel, but full of heavy, heavy water, right? 8 pounds per gallon of water, and they're pushing out 300 to 500 gallons of water per minute. They are heavy. So when we think about that weight sitting on a tire, and after having to slog through a deeper wheel track that's maybe more muddy, been kind of picking up some water over time, it's going to increase that tension on those gearboxes. And if we blow a gearbox during the season, not only are we going to be having some downtime, but also, part replacements, probably a, off-time phone call to a technician to get it fixed. So there's kind of thing about the full system and working with those wheel tracks. Sometimes we want to make sure they don't get too deep, spread the soil too much, and kind of if they're not as deep, we can fix them a bit easier compared to letting them get too deep.
That is correct. So the more rut we have in the field, the more that it actually accumulates more water when there is runoff. So it's a vicious cycle between there. The more water there is, the more it is going to get deeper and deeper and deeper. And again, we would not like to get into the situation that we have to fix the wheels later on in the season. And that's one of the worst nightmare of the farmers, to change a wheel when the corn is already above their height, because it gets a little bit tricky to get there. First of all, and the second is changing it while you are actually needing the water when it's actually needed.
Are there some options for shifting maybe how much pressure is in the wheel or the type of wheel to reduce some of the tracks that could be made around the field?
Yeah, so prior to probably planting, one of the things that we would like to recommend is to actually refill that wheel track. So that, again, as I mentioned, if it has already some ruts, then the water will tend to accumulate on that one, and it will just get worse during the season. So making sure that it is filled up before planting, so that you don't have to deal with it later on in a much more difficult way. So the other thing is, if you are really into an issue that one spot is getting more wheel track issue over the others, is trying to put some more additives on that, either additional stones or gravels a little bit, or sand, just a little bit of communication, because we don't want that to be out of the commission in terms of getting those fields worked on later on. But we just want to help the soil to be able to withstand that heavy weight on the machine itself.
Do you see different problems for different soil types?
Absolutely. Thinking about how water moves through our different soil types, right? If we think about more of a sandy soil, we think about leaching, right? Water moves typically faster through a more sandy soil. But if we think about those high clay soils, and that's where I've seen a lot of wheel tracks get pretty nasty pretty quickly because they tend to pool the water, or maybe they stay wet longer, or even they cause what we like to refer to in the agronomy world as slippage. So when clay gets wet, right, it's just going to keep it, adds kind of some tension to that wheel, and it does kind of slog it down because it's slipping, right? So when we think about soil types, yes, we can see some kind of more soil type specific issues, but there also could be some situations in a field, right? Maybe a lower spot where water we don't think of as a lower spot, but it's maybe pooling a bit more there. So we want to fill those wheel tracks in, whether it's kind of tilling them back in if we're in a tillage system, if maybe it's a pretty severe one, like Jonathan said. Sometimes we actually have to fill them with gravel. So then the system stays upright off those. And yes, that's an expense, but it keeps those machines running over time. And we do lose some of that farmable area if we're having to fill in with gravel, but it's kind of a give or take in some situations. Some may think they just want to change their tires, and then there's been some companies who have these different types of tires that claim to be better for wheel track situations. Often because of the cost of everything else, we're not actually going to go that route. We're probably going to try to fill them in, maybe farm around them, be mindful of them, but we can also change the irrigation sprinklers themselves to move water off the wheel tracks.
That is correct. Trying to get that water out or away from the the wheels itself is also a solution for that. Particularly as it is moving forward, you could put the sprinkler on the backside of the system so that the water is being applied after the wheel has already went through that field. So there are technologies that is able to do that, either just one way or two ways. There are technologies that are available for us.
And thinking about those sprinklers that are pushing, they might be further back. There's also ones that we call our directionals, and they're pushing water just out of that wheel track area.
Jonathan, Tina, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
It's a pleasure to be able to share something.
Yes, thank you, Shelby. Love talking about irrigation.
That was K-State Water Resource Engineer Jonathan Aguilar and K-State Extension Agronomist Tina Sullivan. I will link to Agronomy e-update articles on this topic in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show talking with K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
Joe, wanting to talk about riparian habitats in streams in Kansas. And before we talk about those habitats, how many streams are in Kansas?
Yeah, we have a lot of streams in Kansas. The named number is really high, but really if you break it down to miles, it's about 130,000 miles of streams in Kansas, and that's quite a bit. And most of those are intermittent or ephemeral, meaning that they don't flow all of the time. So they might show up for a brief period of time. They might show up and flow most of the time, but go dry occasionally. So that makes up ephemeral and intermittent streams make up about 80% of those streams, but that still leaves a large number of that 130,000 miles that are flowing year round.
And so a lot of times when you say the word riparian, I think of the phrase riparian buffer. And so how is a riparian buffer different than a riparian habitat?
Yeah, the riparian habitat is the area right next to these aquatic ecosystems. And so they're naturally occurring. It's kind of a transition zone between the aquatic and the terrestrial ecosystems. And so they're a type of habitat that extend near all of these flowing water ecosystems. So a riparian buffer is something that put into our watershed management plan, and that allows us to kind of create this type of habitat. And so a riparian buffer would be allowing a riparian habitat to establish around waterways that we have in the watersheds we're managing for our livestock operations.
You mentioned they're naturally occurring, so do we need to worry about any management for them?
Yeah, I mean, they're naturally occurring, but they're only naturally occurring when we let them. And so if we're farming right up to the edges of these streams, then we're eliminating those naturally occurring habitats. And so in those situations, we would want to do some management actions to try to recreate or encourage the establishment of these riparian habitats around the streams or rivers and on the land that we're managing.
And what benefits do they bring to water quality and water health?
Yeah, they provide a lot of benefits for water quality. So the two really big things that they do is they can hold back sediment and they can hold back nutrients. And when we hold those back in the watershed, it prevents them from getting into livestock watering ponds or irrigation ponds. So they can provide a lot of benefits there. And another type of habitat that goes right along with riparian habitats are wetlands. And so wetlands tend to think of like a filled in or shallow pond. They can hold back up to 80 or 90% of the nitrates that are flowing into the water system. And that can be a big concern. So, these systems are really good at managing themselves and regulating themselves when we let them.
So what could growers, producers be doing to give the opportunity for a riparian habitat to be established?
Yeah, I think the easiest thing is just leave it alone. And so, figuring out areas around these streams and rivers where we can just let kind of, Mother Nature and succession allow different types of plants to grow back. That can provide a lot of benefits for different types of wildlife. So things like mammals, amphibians, reptiles, birds all really love these riparian habitats. Turkeys, it's almost turkey hunting season if you're a hunter and you like to get out. And so turkeys love these habitats. They like to roost in them. They like to feed in them. There's a lot of benefits to them there, but also all of these other species, lots of benefits to the wildlife in addition to the livestock benefits we can see.
Joe, when you look at streams that have a riparian habitat beside them versus ones that don't, do you see a difference?
Yeah, what you would probably see, you would see differences in erosion. That's one of the really big things that occur. So if we can stabilize that bank, we cut down on the amount of sediment being washed into the waterways. We also cut down on the amount of erosion that takes place. The root structure from the plants that grow in these riparian habitats really are able to hold back a lot of that sediment and can reduce erosion. So another reason protecting our land and throughout our landscape and watershed, the areas we're managing, another good reason to protect those riparian habitats.
Joe, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me back.
That was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken discussing riparian habitats. That's what we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.